Okay, we're going to head into a few last points here, and I've got some really exciting video clips. Yes, some really exciting video clips to end out with. The last clip is what happens when Chip preaches. You'll get to see that. You stay away until the end. You'll get to see what happens when he's up there preaching. There's actual video footage of a guy sitting through one of his sermons. And you'll get to see what happens. Yeah. Hang on a little while longer, and you're going to love it. I guarantee you, you are going to love it. It's going to be amazing. The style of the sermon, we have gotten the big idea, figured out the purpose of what we want to say. We're zeroing in on the target, and now we're going to look at okay, what style should we use? And this is, I'm not going to spend much time with this because it can be very technical. I would encourage you, if you want to look deeper into this, to go into Robinson's book, because he actually talks about it quite a bit there. But what is the roadmap? We got the meaning of the text in front of us, so what are we going to do with that? We figured out that it needs the audience. Well, what's the best way for this idea to be developed into a sermon? And I'm only going to talk about 2 of these. Robinson talks about 5 different ways. And again, that just gets really technical. But we looked at before that there's a deductive way in which you basically state what you're going to be saying, and you give 1, 2, 3, 4 points of this is developing this. That's one way to do it. The other way is the inductive, in which you just launch into the text, you let the text say it, and then you conclude by saying, and this is what this means. And you just have to make a decision about that, how you want to do it. I tell you, for me personally, what is easiest for me and what I still do most of the time is just the deductive style. I get deep into the text, but I just sort of state, and I think our people are kind of listening for that and wanting that. But you've got to figure out, okay, what are you going to do with that? And also you've got to figure out, are you going to do it in a narrative way? Do you want to do a narrative sermon? Are you going to tell the story as it goes? Or are you going to make 1, 2, 3 points as you go? And I think some variety is good here. I think you can try it in different ways. But we're going to tend to come back to the one that we feel the most comfortable with, to the one that we feel like we're better at doing this style of sermon. And so I'm not going to try to say that one is better than the other, because the fact is that for different people, it works in different ways. And whatever you feel the best about, that's eventually what you're going to come back to. So I'm just going to, those other slides were from Robinson's book, and let me just give you the deductive that I mentioned before. You got the big idea, you're just going to state that at the beginning, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points, and conclude the sermon. The other is the opposite way. You introduce it, but then you make your points, and then you say, and because of that, this is how we need to live. Because of that, this is what I want you to see from this. So there's 2 different approaches there with the style. And a third one that I can mention also is narrative, and I just wanted to have John Piper here is going to have a couple of things to say about stories, and how stories fit into sermons, and this idea of telling stories or using this narrative style within our sermon.
How do stories fit into expository preaching? Well, I'm in John right now, so right off my front burner, just did, as we were recording here, did John 4, which is a story of Jesus going into Samaria. So, exposition wants to expose, it wants to draw out what's there. And stories have a way of meaning. They don't mean the way an expository, say Romans 5, 1 to 8, mean, but they have meaning. They are told for a reason. So an expositor reads the story, studies the story, and tries to discern what is the author telling the story for. How is he telling it in a way to make his point, whatever the point is? I don't think the Bible contains stories that are merely entertaining. There is such a thing. I would guess even people telling stories of what Jesus did in history that are history, and those stories have intention. So that's what the expositor does. He looks at the story, he tries to discern, why did he go through Samaria? Jews don't like Samaritans. Why did he sit on the well? Right there where in broad daylight, he's contaminating himself with this foreign, unclean, heretical people, and he's going to be forced to talk to one. In fact, he goes out of his way to talk to one, and he chooses to talk to one who's an adulteress. Why is he doing all? Why did he send his disciples into town so that he would be left alone? Why are they going to buy food from a people who made it with hands that would be ceremonially unclean? Why? All these details in this story, and you start to see, oh, this is really about shattering some taboos that are destructive to faith and relationships. So, stories are a greatest gift to us, and faithful exposition should let them be stories, and then try to discern from every story we have why they're there and what they mean.
Why they're there is what they mean. And so it's great to tell stories. Just make sure that you are bringing across the meaning of the text when you tell the stories. People love stories, and they really listen when a story is being told. But the story is just being told for the story, and that becomes entertainment. And as he said, he doesn't think that the Bible has very much of that. And I agree, these stories are being told for a purpose. So we need to see the purpose behind the story. And then, once you see that purpose, and you're trying to get that purpose across, tell the story in a great way. You know, the sermon that he picks, the one about the well, there's so much detail in that. So much great stuff that people will hang on to as you're telling the story. So, you know, if that style is the style that suits you and suits the text, then you go for it, you know. And tell the story in a great way so that people can really grab hold of it. And number 7 is the outline. Eventually, at the end of all this, you're going to outline. The fact is that personally, I outline as I go, because I'm doing the whole thing. I'm taking notes. I'm finding key ideas. I'm finding the sub-points. I sort of get the big idea there, and then I'm looking. And over time, that's what you train yourself to do. I know for me, whenever I read my Bible now, I'm constantly looking at it, and it just starts jumping off the page. I just start seeing the things that need to be highlighted, that need to be talked about. And over time, you teach yourself and you train yourself to do that with the text. I'm also, you know, I tend to write, and I tend to be a writer. Most of my sermons end up in a manuscript form of the lesson. I don't just get up and read it. I still preach it. But as I do that, and as I'm studying my Bible, I'm and over time, that's the way you'll do it as well. But as we're developing our outlines, there's a few things that I think would be helpful for us. First is just to view the sermon as a whole. You're resisting the urge to just jump right to 3 points. So you're trying to figure out, okay, the big idea, what is being said here, what is the message, and you're looking at the whole of the idea. Number 2, you seek to heighten the sense of unity in the message you are to preach. And so you want to make sure that all of the points that you're making fit with the big idea, and they become your points. And you can make subpoints under them. You can make a couple of subpoints underneath the point that you're making. But here's the thing, if you're only making one subpoint, then what is that? It's a point. So you really shouldn't have one subpoint, just make the point. Okay? Just say what's being said there. But if you find a couple of points underneath that, then go ahead and point that, make 2 subpoints there. And so you can have a point, you can have subpoints. You're looking at it just like you would outline anything for school or anything else. And then number 3 is moving from general mapping of the idea to the outline. And so I do this as I go, as I'm going throughout the week. As I start on Monday, I am beginning to outline, I'm breaking things down. Even if I am planning out a 10-week sermon series, I'm already starting to outline. But then I'm going to really break it down to what I want to preach. And that becomes the formal outline of the sermon. A couple other ideas for outlining is that you can write and focus, or write your focus and function statement at the bottom of the paper. So the focus of what I want this thing to say, the function of why I'm preaching the sermon, you can put that down at the bottom of the paper, because that's where you're heading. That's what you want to conclude with. That's what you're building the sermon toward. And then you outline the journey. You think through the key concepts, the points that you want to make. You build from stage to stage. You make sure that the segments between the points are clear and that there's a good distance between the two. You keep continuity. If you have 3 points in the sermon, be careful not to spend 30 minutes on the first point and then you have no time for the last 2. Map it out so that you're spending an equal amount of time.
I understand that.
Okay.
Next week I'll give you 2.
It's like first quarter, second quarter, third quarter.
Oh, is that where that came from?
The same amount of time.
That makes sense now.
Indeed. Yes. So work that line toward the purpose of the sermon, the focus of the sermon, what you want the sermon to say. And then you can develop the outline. It's like developing a symphony. You just add certain things to it. And, typically, this is the pattern that we have followed. You have to state the point, you have the text, and you explain the text, you illustrate the text through analogy or stories or photos or diagrams. You apply the text. And to me, that still works. It's still good. I don't know that there's a reason to change that. I mean, it works just fine, that type of developing the points on the outline like that. But for you, you're just looking for something that's going to help you to be able to communicate the main points. Now, for some people, they write very full outlines. For other people, they are better at thinking on their feet, and so they can write shorter outlines. You got to figure out what works for you. And over the years, I just started writing manuscripts. Did this a few years back, and so every Sunday I have a manuscript. I have it fully written out. But I don't read. I don't just stand up there and read from it. I highlight certain parts of it, and I just preach from the manuscript. But that works for me because I love writing, and it's just for me a discipline. It's something that I love to do. I don't think that's the way everyone needs to do it, but you just need to figure out what works for you. And as you're going through the week, figure out what you have, what you're able to do during the week. Now let's talk a little bit about illustrations, because illustrations are incredibly, incredibly important. Illustrations, again, they're not to inform, and they're not to even clarify the information that you're given. The purpose of an inspiration is really to inspire. You want people to connect. You want them to connect with what you're saying. And so the point of an illustration, for the most part, is to help people to get inspired, to be moved, to laugh, to cry, to connect, something like that. A couple of important points about illustrations. Illustrations illustrate the message. They are not the message in themselves. And I think that it's important that we preach the Scriptures, and the Scripture gives us the message. But if you really spend little time on the Scripture and on the message, all they're going to come away from is that illustration. And illustrations are powerful that way. The illustrations can steal from the text itself if you allow it to happen. There are people that walk away, what'd you learn at church today? I don't know, but I heard a great story. I heard a great joke. You want to hear the joke I heard? But that's the power of illustration. That's why you should include them. It's not that we shouldn't include them. We just need to make sure that they're doing what they need to do in the sermon. And that is to help people connect, to help people get inspired. I heard a preacher preach a full sermon one time on how a Krispy Kreme donut is made. He had seen it in a documentary the night before, Saturday night. And he came in and he shared it with the church the next day. The teens loved it. They were so hungry by the end of his sermon. They thought it was the greatest sermon they'd ever heard in their life. And at the end of it, the very end, he tied some scripture into it. I have no idea what scripture. Or how he got the scripture tied into it, I have no idea.
There's somebody from the south doing it.
That's a Krispy Kreme donut. But he went through the whole process. I mean, 30 minutes of the process of making a Krispy Kreme donut. And I was just sitting there shaking my head like, no, this is not really happening. But yes, it was happening. His message was the illustration. That's all he had that Sunday. I got nothing. I got a donut. So make sure that you use the illustration for the right reason. Here's another little warning. Every heresy begins with a good illustration. I found this somewhere. So just be careful in the way that you use illustrations. Illustrations fill in the outline. They support the material. They can explain, prove, apply, clarify, amplify the major points or any subpoint. You don't necessarily have an illustration for every point that you want to make, but you can have an illustration for every point that you want to make. It's up to you. But just make sure that when you're using them, that it is something that connects with the point that's being made and also helps people to connect with the point that's being made. That's mainly what you want to do with the illustration. So we want people to walk away with some thoughts in their mind that, wow, that helps me to get it. That helps me to understand it. And I feel that now. I feel that in my heart now. Fred Craddock, I think, does a good job right here sort of illustrating the use of illustrations. So let me just go with him right here.
When I was a kid on the farm, my sister and my brothers and I would play hide and seek. You can play that in the country and it doesn't cost anything. And we grew tired of it, but we played it. You remember how it goes. One person is it, and whoever is it hides the eyes, counts to 100, and says, coming, ready or not, and you're supposed to be hidden. And then the person who's it comes looking, and the first one that's found, run back, touch the base 3 times and say, you're it, and then that person is it. Quite simple. My sister was it. When my sister was it, she cheated. Well, she started off honestly enough. She would say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 93, 94. But I had a place under the porch and under the steps in the porch. Because of my size, I could get under there. And I knew she'd never find me. 99, 100, here I come, ready or not. And here she came, in the house, out of the house, in the weeds, in the trees, down the corn crib, in the barn. She couldn't find me. Almost gave myself away. Down under there, just snickering to myself, she'll never find me here. She'll never find me here. And then it occurred to me, she'll never find me here. So after a while, I would stick out a toe. And she came by, and she saw my toe, and she said, oh, I see. And she'd run back, touch the base 3 times, and say, ah, you're it, you're it. And I would come out, brushing myself off, and say, oh, Jude, you found me. You found me. What did I want? What did I really want? The very same thing.